The cashier at the grocery store didn't look away as she slid my card through the machine for the third time. The little red light blinked with a mocking finality, and the screen displayed the words insufficient funds in a font that felt like a scream. I felt the heat rise from my neck to my cheeks, the prickle of humiliation stinging my eyes as the line of people behind me began to murmur and shift their weight. This wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't a mistake by the bank. It was the first crack in a dam that was about to burst, revealing that my entire marriage had been a carefully constructed stage play where I was the only one who didn't know the script. My husband, Mark, had spent years whispering that he was my protector. Yet I was standing there realizing he had been systematically bleeding me dry to fund a life for his mother that we couldn't afford. And he had done it all while looking me in the eye every single morning. Before that moment at the register, my life felt like a masterpiece of stability. I am an interior architect by trade, a profession that demands an eye for structure and a deep appreciation for the bones of a home. My own home was my pride and joy, a sprawling, mid-century modern jewel on the edge of the city that my father had left to me. It wasn't just real estate. It was a sanctuary of cedar wood, floor-to-ceiling glass, and memories of a man who taught me that a woman's greatest asset is her independence. When I married Mark 5 years ago, I felt like I had found the final piece of the puzzle. He was an accountant, steady, methodical, and seemingly grounded. He didn't mind that I earned more or that the house was solely in my name. "Your success is our success, Jules," he would say, kissing my forehead as he brewed the morning coffee, the scent of hazelnut filling our sun-drenched kitchen. Our life followed a rhythm that I found deeply comforting. We had Saturday morning trips to the farmer's market, Sunday drives in my vintage convertible, and a shared dream of one day opening a boutique design firm together. Mark was the man who remembered my favorite obscure tea brand and always made sure my car's gas tank was full. He was the good one, according to my friends. The husband who didn't grumble about helping with the dishes or attending gallery openings. But in the quiet corners of our perfection, there was always Barbara. Mark's mother, Barbara, lived in a world of temporary setbacks that had lasted for 3 decades. She was a woman of expensive tastes and a vanishing bank account, a retired socialite who treated her son like a personal valet and a high-limit credit card. In the beginning, her requests were small, almost invisible. A loan for a dental procedure here, a contribution to her escalating utility bills there. I tolerated it because I loved Mark, and I saw how his shoulders slumped whenever her name popped up on his phone. I viewed her as a minor tax on our happiness, a slightly annoying but manageable price to pay for the peace we shared. "She's just lonely, Julia," Mark would plead when I'd mention the third emergency of the month. "Since Dad passed, she doesn't have anyone else. I'm her only son. I can't just let her drown." I would sigh, soften, and reach for my checkbook. I felt powerful in my ability to provide, and Mark's gratitude was a potent drug. He made me feel like a hero for helping his family. We lived in my house, we drove cars paid for by my commissions, and we ate meals funded by my hard work. I didn't mind being the primary breadwinner. I took pride in it. I thought we were a team, a unit where my strength covered his family's weaknesses. The first real shadow fell across our doorstep 6 months ago. Barbara had decided that her 2-bedroom apartment was depressing and unfit for a woman of her standing. She didn't just want a new place. She wanted a lifestyle. Mark began spending hours in the home office, his brow furrowed over spreadsheets he'd quickly close whenever I entered the room. The air in the house changed. The warmth of the cedar and the soft glow of the evening lamps felt thinner, as if the very atmosphere was being sucked out through the vents. "Is everything okay with the accounts, Mark?" I asked one evening, leaning against the doorframe. The scent of his expensive bourbon lingered in the air, a bottle I had bought him for our anniversary. "Fine, honey. Just some tax season stress," he'd say, flashing that practiced, boyish smile that usually made my heart melt. But for the first time, I noticed how it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were darting toward the drawer where we kept the emergency house fund, a fund that was supposed to be for our future children's education. I didn't push. I trusted him. I believed in the man I saw every morning, not the ghost who was beginning to haunt our finances. I went back to my drafting table, sketching out plans for a client's mansion, unaware that the foundation of my own life was being hollowed out, brick by the person I shared a bed with. I was the architect of beautiful spaces, but I was completely blind to the rot that was spreading behind my own walls. The grocery store incident wasn't just a declined card. It was the sound of the first support beam snapping. I walked through the front door, the heavy grocery bags cutting into my palms, my heart still hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of the designer lamps I had carefully curated, but the silence felt heavy, almost oily. Mark was in the living room, his laptop perched on his knees, the blue light reflecting in his glasses. He looked up, his expression a mask of practiced concern that I was only now beginning to see through. "The card was declined, Mark," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the vastness of our open-plan living room. "At the checkout, in front of everyone." He didn't jump. He didn't even flinch. He just sighed, a long, weary sound, and closed his laptop. "I told you, Jules, the bank is flagging everything lately because of that security breach last month. I'll call them in the morning. It's probably just a temporary freeze. Don't let it ruin your evening." He stood up, walked over, and took the bags from my hands, his touch lingering on my wrists. "You're working too hard. You're stressed, and you're seeing shadows where there aren't any." I wanted to believe him. I desperately needed to believe that the man who held me every night wasn't a stranger. But over the next few weeks, the shadows didn't just stay. They grew. I began to notice things. Small, jagged pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit. Barbara started appearing at the house more frequently, always wearing something new. A silk scarf that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a pair of Italian leather shoes, a shimmering gold bracelet that clinked aggressively against her wrist. "A gift from a friend," she'd say with a feline smile when I'd ask, her eyes darting to Mark. Then there were the phone calls. Mark would retreat to the garage or the back deck, his voice a low, urgent murmur that cut off the second I opened a door. When he came back inside, he'd be flushed, his movements jerky and nervous. He started asking questions that felt like probes. Questions about the equity in the house, about why I kept my primary savings account in my name only. And wouldn't it be simpler for our future if we consolidated everything into a joint trust? "It's about protection, Julia," he argued one night, the air thick with the smell of the expensive cigars he'd suddenly taken up smoking. "If something happened to you, the legal nightmare for me to keep this house would be insane. We're a team, remember? Why are you holding on to these walls like they're more important than our partnership?" He was using my own values against me, twisting my father's legacy into a sign of my lack of trust. I felt a gnawing sense of guilt, wondering if I was being too guarded, too cynical. I started to doubt my own instincts, dismissing the cold pit in my stomach as exhaustion. I was wrong. The point of no return came on a Tuesday, a day so ordinary it seemed impossible that it could be the day my life ended. Mark was at a late-night client consultation, and I was in our home office looking for a property tax statement I needed for a renovation permit. I checked the usual filing cabinet, but it was empty. Frustrated, I started opening drawers I usually left to Mark. In the very back of his desk, hidden beneath a stack of old magazines, I found a plain manila envelope. It wasn't tucked away. It was buried. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. Inside was a thick stack of documents. The first page was a loan application. A second mortgage on my house. My breath hitched. I flipped to the last page. There, at the bottom, was my signature. I stared at it until the lines blurred. It looked like my handwriting. The slant was right. The way I crossed my T's was perfect. But I had never signed this. I had never even seen this paper. I looked at the date. It was from 3 months ago. The same week Mark had taken me on a surprise weekend getaway to a spa, claiming I needed to disconnect and just sign some updated insurance forms he'd brought along while I was lightheaded from a massage. Beneath the mortgage papers was something even worse, a series of bank transfers. Huge, staggering sums of money, nearly $200,000, had been moved from the newly opened loan account directly into an account held by Barbara. There were also receipts. a lease agreement for a luxury penthouse in the city's most expensive district, a down payment for a brand new Mercedes, all of it funded by the equity in my father's house. The room began to spin. A violent wave of nausea surged up my throat, and I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. My pulse was a deafening roar in my ears, a rhythmic thud that felt like a hammer striking an anvil. I couldn't draw enough air into my lungs. It felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the cold, sterile scent of betrayal. My legs felt like water, and I sank to the floor, the cold hardwood pressing against my skin as I clutched the papers to my chest. He hadn't just helped his mother. He had stolen my inheritance, my security, and my father's memory to buy his mother a life of luxury she hadn't earned, and he had used my own hand to do it. The man I loved was a thief, and home, the only place I felt safe, was now a ticking financial time bomb. I sat there in the dark, the silence of the house now feeling like the silence of a tomb, waiting for the sound of his key in the lock. The woman who had walked into that office was gone. The person left on the floor was someone I didn't recognize, fueled by a cold, crystalline terror that was slowly, very slowly, turning into something much sharper. The sound of Mark's key in the lock felt like a gunshot in the silent house. I didn't move. I stayed sitting at his desk, the forged documents spread out before me like a deck of cards from a game I had already lost. I heard him humming a light, airy tune, the sound of a man without a care in the world, as he tossed his keys onto the marble entryway table. "Jules, why are you sitting in the dark, honey?" He called out, his voice brimming with that false, practiced warmth. I switched on the desk lamp. The sudden pool of light made him flinch as he stood in the doorway. He was wearing a new wool coat I hadn't seen before, probably another gift he'd bought himself with my house's equity. His smile faltered, then vanished as his eyes traveled down to the papers on the desk. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "How much is her Mercedes worth, Mark?" I asked, my voice sounding like grinding stones. "I'm just trying to do the math. How many square feet of my father's legacy did it take to buy your mother a leather interior?" Mark's face went through a sickening transformation. First, there was the wide-eyed shock of a trapped animal, then a flicker of calculating coldness, and finally a mask of weary indignation. He didn't run. He didn't apologize. He walked into the room and closed the door behind him with a click that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have been snooping in my desk, Julia," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "That's a violation of trust." I let out a harsh, jagged laugh that hurt my throat. "Trust? You forged my signature on a second mortgage, Mark. You stole $200,000 from the bones of this house. You've been funneling my earnings, my inheritance, into a lifestyle for Barbara that we can't afford. And you want to talk to me about trust?" "I did what I had to do for my family," he snapped, stepping closer, his shadow looming over the desk. "My mother was living in a dump. She was depressed, Julia. She deserved a life of dignity. You have so much, this house, your career. Why are you being so greedy about a few numbers on a screen?" "A few numbers?" I stood up, my chair screeching against the floor. "That money was for our future. For the children we talked about. For my retirement. And you didn't just take the equity, did you?" I grabbed another piece of paper I'd found at the bottom of the envelope. A statement from my personal brokerage account. "You've been draining my investment portfolio too. You had the passwords, the power of attorney I gave you when I was sick last year. It's all gone, isn't it?" Mark didn't answer. He looked at the floor, his jaw tight. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, paralyzed by his own cowardice. The front door opened again, and the sound of high heels clicking on the hardwood announced the arrival of the architect of this misery. Barbara walked into the office, draped in a mink coat that smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked annoyed. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mark, I told you she'd find out eventually," Barbara said, tossing her clutch onto my drafting table as if she owned the place. "Julia, dear, don't be so dramatic. It's just money. Mark is my son. He has a responsibility to take care of me. It's the natural order of things. The natural order involves identity theft and bank fraud, Barbara? I spat. You're living in a penthouse you didn't earn, driving a car bought with stolen blood. I want you out of that apartment, and I want the money back. Barbara let out a dry, rattling laugh. The money is spent, darling. The lease is signed for 3 years, and the car is in my name. You can't touch it. Besides, she leaned in, her eyes glinting with a terrifying malice. Mark told me how you hold your success over his head. How you make him feel like a servant in this house because your name is on the deed. He's a man, Julia. He deserves to feel like he has some control. I turned to Mark, hoping for some shred of the man I thought I married. Is that what this is? You stole from me because you felt insecure about my paycheck? Mark finally looked up, and the resentment in his eyes was a physical blow. I'm a man, not your ATM, Julia. Every time you bought something for this house, every time you paid for a vacation, you were reminding me that I'm second place. Helping my mother was the only thing that felt like mine. I'm the head of this family, and if that means I have to balance the scales behind your back, then so be it. The logic was so warped, so fundamentally broken, that for a moment I couldn't speak. He was calling himself a man while hiding behind my skirts and stealing from my pockets. You're not the head of anything, Mark, I said, my voice trembling with a new, cold clarity. You're a thief, and there's one more thing. I held up the final document I'd pulled from the envelope. A notice from the bank. You haven't been making the payments on that second mortgage, have you? You were so busy playing the big spender for your mother that you forgot the bank actually expects their money back. The house is in default. We have 30 days before they start foreclosure proceedings. The color drained from Mark's face. Even Barbara went still. I was going to handle that. Mark stammered, his bravado evaporating. I had a system. I just needed another month. A big commission was coming in. There is no commission big enough to fix this, I said, leaning over the desk until I was inches from his face. You didn't just betray me, Mark. You burned our home to the ground to keep your mother warm, and you're both going to watch it turn to ash. Now, let's be reasonable, Julia. Barbara started, her voice losing its edge, replaced by a sugary, manipulative tone. We're family. We can talk about this. Maybe we can sell some of your father's art collection? That would cover the arrears. I looked at her, then at the man who had stood by and let her say it. The betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a layered, suffocating blanket they had been weaving around me for years. Get out, I said. Julia, let's just talk later, when you're not so emotional. Mark said, reaching for my arm. I flinched away as if his skin were acid. There is no later. There is no us. Get out of my house, Mark. Take your mother, take your lies, and get out before I call the police and show them exactly whose signature is on these loan papers. You wouldn't, Mark whispered, his eyes searching mine for the soft, forgiving woman he thought he knew. You love me. I loved a ghost, I said, and ghosts don't have a place in this house anymore. The silence that followed their departure was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I sat in the center of my living room, the blueprints of my life scattered and torn, and waited for the familiar surge of tears. But they didn't come. Instead, something deep inside me, the part of me that understood how to build structures that could withstand a 100-year storm, simply clicked into place. The heat of my betrayal cooled into a hard obsidian resolve. I wasn't a victim. I was an architect. And it was time to redesign this disaster. The next morning, I didn't call Mark. I didn't answer his 53 frantic texts. Instead, I sat down with Sarah, a friend from college who specialized in forensic accounting, and Mr. Henderson, the shark of a lawyer who had handled my father's estate. We sat in my sun-drenched kitchen, the scent of hazelnut coffee now replaced by the sterile smell of highlighter ink and old paper. He was sloppy, Julia, Sarah said, tapping her pen against a spreadsheet. He thought he was clever using a shell company to lease Barbara's apartment, but he used your home IP address to set up the wire transfers. And the signatures. They're high-quality forgeries, but he used a digital pad that recorded the metadata. It shows the signing happened at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when you were logged into your design software on your main computer. You can't be in two places at once. I don't just want the money back, Sarah, I said, my voice steady and cold. I want them to feel the weight of every lie they told. Oh, they will, Mr. Henderson whispered, sliding a folder across the table. Because he didn't just steal from you. He lied to a federalized banking institution. That's not just a divorce issue. That's a felony. The retribution didn't happen in a courtroom, not at first. It happened at the grand housewarming gala Barbara was throwing at her stolen penthouse. She had invited half the city's socialites, preening in her mink and dripping in the jewelry my father's sweat had paid for. Mark was there, playing the role of the devoted, successful son, sipping champagne as if he hadn't spent the afternoon begging me for a second chance via voicemail. I walked in just as Barbara was mid-toast, her glass raised to the rewards of a life well lived. The room went silent as I moved through the crowd. I wasn't wearing the mourning black of a betrayed wife. I was in a sharp, blood-red blazer that felt like armor. Beautiful party, Barbara, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. It's amazing what a person can do with $200,000 of stolen equity. Mark's glass shattered on the marble floor. Julia, what are you doing here? Let's talk outside. No, Mark, we're done talking in the dark, I said, pulling a thick stack of papers from my bag. I'm here to give your guests a little reading material. It's the forensic audit of how this lifestyle was funded. Page 4 is my favorite. It's where the bank's fraud department confirms that the signatures on the mortgage were forged from our home office. I started handing the papers to the guests nearest to me. The whispers began like a rising tide. Barbara's face turned a shade of gray that matched her expensive silk wallpaper. You're insane, she shrieked, her voice cracking. Mark, get her out of here. Mark can't do much of anything right now, Barbara, I said, glancing toward the door as two men in dark suits entered. Because while you were picking out centerpieces, I was at the district attorney's office. They're very interested in the wire transfers Mark made to your shell company. The look on Mark's face as the detectives approached him was the most honest thing I had seen in 5 years. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified gaze of a man who finally realized that he wasn't the protagonist of this story. He was the villain. I did it for us, Julia, he yelled as they let him out in handcuffs, the flashbulbs of several guests' phones capturing his fall from grace. I just wanted us to be equals. We were never equals, Mark, I said, watching him pass. I was the foundation. You were just the rot in the walls. The legal fallout was swift and merciless. Because the mortgage was fraudulent, my lawyer was able to freeze the assets tied to the loan. Barbara was evicted 48 hours later, her mink coats and Italian shoes piled on the sidewalk like trash. Mark accepted a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentence, but he's currently serving 3 years for bank fraud and identity theft. I didn't ask for alimony. I didn't want a single cent of his tainted future. I just wanted my name back. 6 months later, I sat on my back deck, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy, oily silence of before. It was the peaceful stillness of a sanctuary that had been cleansed. The second mortgage had been cleared, the bank admitting their negligence in verifying the signatures, and my savings were slowly beginning to recover. I took a sip of my tea, the cool evening air brushing against my face. I looked at the cedar wood and the glass, the structure my father had built and that I had saved. I had spent so long trying to design a life for someone else, trying to shore up the weaknesses in a man who was happy to see me crumble. But as I watched the first stars appear, I realized that the most important thing I had ever built wasn't a house or a career. It was the woman standing on this deck. I am an architect, and I have finally learned the most important rule of the trade. You can never build something beautiful on a foundation of lies. Now, for the first time in my life, I am standing on solid ground.